record. Okay, you should be good now.
Okay. As they say, I got my degree in canon law from the University of St. Paul in Ottawa in 1990. And I was appointed judicial vicar for the diocese in 1994 by then Bishop George. And I've been in that capacity ever since. So obviously, I like what I do. And I find that canon law, despite what people may think, has some very interesting aspects about life. So the office is established primarily to give advice to the bishop on canonical issues or issues of law in the church. Canon law was not really established until 1917. Prior to that, the church ran on decrees and proclamations and motu proprios and things like this. St. Raymond Penafort, back in the 1200s, was asked to compile all of those decrees and to, again, have some system by which the church could operate. But as I say, in 1917, we had a formal code of canon law. It was all in Latin. It was forbidden to be translated into any other language. We were working under the 1917 code until 1983, when Pope John Paul II issued a new set of canons and updated it. And so this is the canons that we're working under right now. In 1990, he established a new code for the Eastern churches also. So we have the Code of Canon Law for the Latin Church, and then the Code of Canon Law for the Eastern churches. Also part of canon law, all the liturgical books that we use in celebrations of our different sacraments, as well as the missal and the lectionary that we use for our masses. So this is all part of canon law. So it's not just rules and regulations, but it's also how we celebrate and what we celebrate in the church. So the Office of Canonical Concern, like I say, is there to help the bishop in different matters that arise to him about legal issues in the church and the people's rights and responsibilities. The code is intended not to be something that is imposed on people to rule and judge their lives, but it's a means by which to help them grow in their grace in God's life. And the last canon states that very specifically, that all the canons are there for the purpose of the salvation of souls. And that's how we interpret the canons, is how does this help people grow in their relationship with God? So we have such things as dispensations, privileges, grants of various kinds. So that, again, it's meant to be there as a service to people rather than to try to say, you have to do this or you can't do that. Canon law is also very much different from the constitutional law that we live under as civil society. In civil society, the law is canon law is there to help keep the order of our society, to give directions, to again, guide people so that we can live in the common good for one another and help one another and build up our society and help one another so that we can be good citizens as well as good Christians. So both canon law and civil law has that purpose in mind, is to, again, help people live good lives. Like I say, the difference, though, what we have in canon law is that we try to apply the law according to the needs of individuals and how does this help them in their life with God. The constitutional law is based on former decisions, and then then judgments are made, and then that is imposed upon all people. Canon law, again, we have laws that, again, try to guide us and help us to keep that order, but there's going to be exceptions to certain things. And so the code allows that so that the person's soul can be saved and that they can grow closer to God. So that's kind of a quick background on the whole issue of canon law in the church. A lot of people are even surprised that the church has specific laws for itself. So one of the purposes of that, the code also is to, again, help people see how they might be able to encourage and help each other grow in their faith, to grow in their life with God. So it's not just something that's imposed from on high, but it's something that, again, says to the people, this is how we can help one another to grow in our faith. This is a way in which, again, we can uplift and support one another. So the code, again, is given to us as a gift to help us to be good Christians, good Catholics. One of the biggest issues that we face in the Office of Canonical Concerns, of course, is marriage law. And we deal with marriage cases, those marriages that have failed, and people are inquiring what is their canonical status now that they've been married and the marriage has broken up. So we deal with that as primary, you might say, our bread and butter in the office. So before I go further, what I'd like to do is just take the time to look at the canons on marriage itself, because this is the basis for which we make decisions on marriage cases. Again, there's a real difference between civil society's understanding of marriage and the canon, the church's understanding of marriage. Marriage and the civil society were based on Roman property laws, believe it or not on anything romantic, or it's just simply, this is the trade and how do you treat each other fairly. And so one of the ways to do that is that you make contracts. I'll do this if you do that. And as long as we do this and that, then we're fine. And everything moves along smoothly. But somewhere along the line, the partner or the people decide that they want to end the contract, they simply end the contract. And that's what marriage basically is looked at in civil society. It's contract between two people. I'm sure they may love each other and have all the intentions of lifelong marriage and things like that. But as far as the civil law is concerned, if they want to end the contract we call marriage, they do so by going through the process of a divorce. In the church, though, marriage is much more. For instance, in Canon 1055, number 1, this is how we define marriage. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership for the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to a dignity of a sacrament between baptized persons. So that's our definition of marriage. So it's a matrimonial covenant. It's where two people want to commit themselves to helping each other throughout their lives. It's a way in which, again, they say, I'll be there for you, and I want you to be there for me, that we help each other grow and to fulfill our potential, to, again, help each other so that we can be the best human beings as possible, and that it's a way in which, again, we do that by the interchange, the interpersonal relationship that we develop. And again, we understand marriage to be between a man and a woman. And because, again, they fulfill each other, they help one another so that they can bring the best out of one another. And it's established between them as a partnership. It's not one is more superior to the other, is that they are working together, making decisions together, helping each other out, again, being there, supporting one another, helping one another so that they can live a rich and embellished life because of the concern and care that they show for one another. And it's for the whole of life. It's not just temporary and then, live it for a while and then forget it and go someplace else. That it's really meant to be a whole lifelong process, because the church understands that marriage relationship is a mystery. We're always discovering something more about another person. We see new dimensions in that other. They help us bring out dimensions of ourselves that we don't always have understood that we had or recognized in ourselves. And so, again, it's a partnership for the whole of life that, again, they're working to help each other to be as fully human as that is possible. And so marriage is ordered, as it says, for the good of the spouses. They want to, again, be there to help each other, to support each other, to, again, maybe even challenge each other sometimes to live a deeper, better life. It's, again, providing for the material things and necessities of life for one another, being able there to, again, to have hopefully a happy and a good relationship with one another. And then the other purpose of it is that it's the procreation and education of offspring, that this is the way that the human family continues to develop, is by the love that the husband and wife have for each other. They can extend that love to others, particularly children that are born from their married life. And because this is really meant to be a means of salvation for one another, this is why the code says that's been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. This is how they, again, grow in their grace, is the way in which, again, they live their life, the ways in which, again, they support and encourage each other to be the best that they can be. And so, as we see, it's not just something that it's a contract, it's a very much a covenant that's meant to be two people intertwining their lives together, that they really work at being one with each other. And as the scripture says, that they become one mind, one heart, and one flesh. And so, again, this is the grace that God gives to married couples, is that they can, again, help each other to be the very best that God can provide in them. And so the Canon 1055 number 2 says that for this reason, a valid matrimonial contract cannot exist between baptized without it being by that fact a sacrament. The way in which, again, we're commanded by Christ to love our neighbor as ourselves. And this is lived out in the relationship of husband and wife, particularly, how they work that out, how they work through their differences, how they are there to support, encourage each other, how they, again, live that love and care for each other, reminds us of that Christ is also loving us, that we're his spouses, and that he wants to literally offer his life for us. So that this is really being lived out as a couple make self-sacrifices for one another, and thus grow into being a sign of God's grace, a sign of God's blessing, a sign that, again, we can love one another as God has loved us, as Christ has loved us. So that's our definition. And like I say, it's much more extensive than that of civil society, which sees it simply as a contract, and how they want to live it out or how they live it out is totally up to them. They make the conditions for the marriage. But for us in the church, marriage is a sacrament in which, again, two people give themselves to one another to form this love, this thing called marriage. And it becomes for us, again, a sign of what it means to be a follower of Christ. So the Canon 1056 says that the essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, which in Christian marriage obtains a special firmness by the reason of the sacrament. The purpose of two people getting together, the church is trying to say, is that they want to build a united life together, that they are constantly trying to learn how to give and take with one another, how they can grow out of selfishness to be selfless for the other, and in a sense that they are willing to die to themselves so that they might have life with this partner. And it's an indissoluble commitment that they make to each other. This is something that, again, they do until death do them part. If you look at the marriage vows, you'll see, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, for a good time and bad times, until death do us part. That they are making that commitment that they continue to work together, continue to strive for the same common goals, hopefully have the same dreams, and that they, again, are making that a reality by the way in which they live their lives. And so, again, as the canon says, that Christian marriage obtains a special firmness by the reason of it being a sacrament, that God is blessing them in the ways in which, again, they are working together, the ways in which they are growing together, the ways in which, again, they're making their marriage life hopefully happy and continuing to be deepened in their commitment stronger every day of their lives. Okay. And then Canon 1057, number 1, says that the consent of the parties legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law makes marriage, and no human power is able to supply this consent. In the Middle Ages, the question arose, when does actually marriage take place? Some said it was at the time of consent, when the parties gave the yes to one another. Others said no, it wasn't until they had consummated the marriage. And there was quite a controversy for almost the whole century, the 13th century, about exactly when does marriage come about. And Canon 1057 kind of answers that question when it says consent of the parties legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law makes marriage, and no human power is able to supply this consent. And so what the church says is, at the time when the parties say, I give myself to you, that is when marriage takes place. So it's at the time of consent that marriage takes a formal procession of their lives. And again, nobody can do this for them. It has to be a free will decision, a free way in which, again, they say, I want this relationship. I want you as my partner. I want you as the person who will influence my life. You are the one that I want to engage life with. And so that has to be, as Canon 1057 number 2 says, matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept each other through an irrevocable covenant in order to establish marriage. They have the intention when they come to the altar to say, I take you as my husband or my wife. I mutually give myself to you, and I accept the gifts that you offer to me so that we can have this covenant where, again, we offer and commit ourselves to living life together. And that establishes marriage. And that's going to be very important, because later on, if we look at a case where the marriage has been broken, that's the first question we're going to ask is, what happened at the time when they gave consent to one another? Because it's at that point that marriage takes place. And Canon 1058 says, all persons who are not prohibited by law can contract marriage. The church sees marriage as a natural right. It's not something that's granted by civil authorities or by parents, or it's been granted to us by God himself. And so the church says that all persons, if this is their vocation and this is their choice, have a right to have this matrimonial ceremony and to make this commitment to one another. Again, the previous canon said if they're not prohibited by law, and what they mean is things like the law prohibits first cousins, for instance, of getting married, or brothers and sisters. There may be somebody who is mentally incapacitated to make the commitment, so they might be prohibited from getting married. But again, this is a right granted by God, and we have to try to respect that. And then Canon 1059 says, even if only one party is Catholic, the marriage of Catholics is governed not only by divine law, but also by canon law, without prejudice to the competence of civil authority concerning the merely civil effects of the same marriage. What the church is trying to protect here is its right to celebrate the sacrament of marriage, that the church has a right to, again, witness the marriage between a man and a woman. So this is primarily 1800s, when the Vatican State was being attacked, and they wanted it to become part of Italy. There was this whole thing about maybe the church's rights would be taken away. And so this canon just continues to exercise the right that we celebrate the sacrament of matrimony, and we have it by divine right, and we have it by the laws that govern ourselves, and that we try to cooperate with the civil authorities in areas concerning things like legitimacy, property rights, things like that, civil effects that are created by the marriage. So it's Canon 1059, like I say, is the church's way of saying we have a right to witness marriages because it's part of our Christian heritage. It's a sacrament in which two people, again, are asking God to bless them in a life of selfless love and care for each other. And then Canon 1060 says, marriage possesses the favor of the law. Therefore, in a case of doubt, the validity of a marriage must be upheld until contrary is proven. Basically, what this canon is saying is that we have a presupposition that anytime somebody does a marriage, they commit themselves to marriage, it is a valid marriage. So if a case of doubt arises, for instance, they break up and they get a divorce, and they want to have their case looked at, we start with the point of view that you had a valid marriage, and you will have to show why the marriage would be invalid. And again, that it's no matter how the celebration was performed, if it was performed because they were tree lovers and they did a marriage ceremony before a tree, and they gave themselves to each other, the church would consider that valid. If they could be jumping out of planes, doing a parachute jump and saying, I do, or under the water. And there's all kinds of ridiculous ways in which people have celebrated their marriage. But as long as it's manifested in a way in which they are committing themselves to each other, the church says, okay, you're a valid marriage, and that marriage, as far as we are concerned, must last for the whole of your life. And again, we go back to what Jesus says, that if a man has married and divorces his wife and remarries, then they commit adultery. So the church says, rather than questioning every marriage, we just simply say our presumption is that when you married, all the conditions necessary for a lifelong commitment was present, and therefore you gave consent. It was heard by people, and therefore we presume that you are validly married and that you'll live out that married life. Okay. Canon 1061, numbers 1, 2, and 3 says, a valid marriage between the baptized is called ratum tantum if it has not been consummated. It is called ratum et consummatum if the spouses have performed between themselves in the human fashion a conjugal act in which is suitable in itself for the procreation of offspring, to which marriage is ordered by its nature and by which the spouses become one flesh. Again, the church has sees the reality that sometimes people get married, but they don't consummate the marriage. Then if they have consummated, then it's ratum et consummatum. They've given the consent. They're now living their life together, sharing their life, and having relationships in which, again, they bring about children, and that they will raise and hopefully give good example to. So, for instance, when my brother Joe was in Moses Lake, he had a couple come into them. They had been married maybe 6 months, and they were wondering why they hadn't had a baby yet. Well, after a little bit of inquiry, my brother found out that they had not had consummated the marriage. They didn't realize that that's how children come about. They lived a very naive life. They really thought that the stork was going to come and give them a baby. And so he had to, again, help them to remember that it is by their relationship that children are brought about. Sometimes people get married because they simply want to use it as a means of getting legitimized in this country to get legal documents. And so they have no intention of consummating the marriage. So we have a term for that, ratum tantum. Okay. And then number 2 of Canon 1061 says, after a marriage has been celebrated, if the spouses have lived together, consummation is presumed until the contrary is proven. One of the things that we would naturally think is that if 2 people are getting married, that they would like to have a show of which their love for each other, and one of the ways to do that is through their sexual activity. And so the church presumes that this happens, and if there is any question about it, then we have to be able to show that the consummation did not take place. For instance, it could be something like a woman married a man in the military, and this happens, you see this quite often. They get married the day before he has to leave for new duties, and they just haven't had time to be together sexually. But it is presumed that after a certain period of time that they have consummated the marriage. Canon 1061 number 3 says, an invalid marriage is called punitive if at one party celebrated it in good faith until both parties become certain of its nullity. Again, the church is simply trying to say that once a marriage has been declared invalid, that this is hurtful to the party who has, in good faith, wanted to live a lifelong commitment to this other person. And it continues to be punitive, hurtful to the party who in good faith wanted the marriage until the other is certain that the marriage is not valid. And then Canon 1062, number 1 says, a promise of marriage, whether unilateral or bilateral, which is called an engagement, is governed by the particular law established by the Conference of Bishops after it has considered any existing customs and civil laws. So the church is recognizing that often there is an engagement period before the marriage. Sometimes it's publicly known, they announce it. Sometimes they just have the kind of informal engagement. And so whatever the particular law of the country or the custom of the country is, depends on how the engagement will be looked at and how the engagement will affect the marriage itself. Maybe an example of this would be that they have a 6-month engagement, but at the end of the engagement, one of the parties decide that they do not want to go through with the marriage. So what would the law say about that? Can they just simply end the relationship and go their separate ways? Or is there any kind of situations where maybe they need to pay back the other person for living expenses or things like this? So number 2 of Canon 1062 says, a promise to marry does not give rise to an action to seek a celebration of marriage. An action to repair damages, however, does arise if warranted. So again, the code is trying to say that if somebody does not wish to enter into marriage, they cannot be forced to do so. Even though there may have been all kinds of expenses already incurred, the hall and the musicians and the caterer and those kinds of things. And it says in that case, that repair of damages does arise and is warranted. So again, they have to work out how do they pay for those things? How do they reimburse one another? How can they, again, get things in a level area where they're not financially drained or hurt by what was supposed to take place at a wedding ceremony. So those are the canons, particularly on married life, that the church has. And these are, like I say, the guidelines for which we handle a case, a nullity case for marriage. I just want to maybe go through with you a little bit too, the process for having a marriage investigated. First of all, we do not go around asking people, do you want your marriage declared null? As they say, we don't go around knocking on closed doors. Somebody has to approach us for us to investigate it. And they do that by presenting a petition called the libellus, in which they, again, ask the court to investigate the validity of their marriage. Marriage obviously took place, a divorce took place, and now they want to know, is this considered by the church a valid marriage? And so that's what we're going to start off with, because as I mentioned, the canon says that we presume all marriages to be valid. And so what happens is the person who wants to seek the declaration of nullity is called the petitioner. He or she is the one who wants the investigation to take place. The former spouse is called the respondent. He responds to the accusation that the marriage is invalid. Both have the same rights in the church. Both have a right to present their experience of the marriage or their viewpoint of what happened in the marriage. Both have the right to have advocates to help them through this process. Both of them have the right to name witnesses, and both of them have the right to see what the other person has written or testified to in their testimony. When the petitioner asks us to investigate the marriage, we contact the respondent and ask for his or her cooperation with it. We hope that both sides will give their side of the story, you might say, that both will give what they perceive as happened in what caused the breakup of the marriage. When a petition is given to us, one of the things is that the judicial vicar, before he can accept the case, is to ask the defender of the bond, that's the person who is to defend the bond, that they are to say, this is the reason why this declaration cannot be given. And they make points of why they believe the marriage should be considered, and the presumption remain that it's a valid marriage. Our defenders of the bond in the diocese are Monsignors Thomas Champeau, Father David Jimenez, Father Solomon Coruvias is a defender of the bond ad causam. That means he's at times given a case to review. And then Father Jesus Mariscal, who just received his master's degree or his JCL from Rome this last June, is also a defender of the bond. Also, the court has what is called a guardian. That's a person who, he happens to be Monsignor Seiler, that if a case, for one reason or not, the respondent cannot participate, the guardian is appointed to the case to be sure that the procedures and the rights of the other party are being observed. So when the petition is presented to us, then it's given to the defender of the bond to see if they have any objections to the case being heard. And if there is not, then again, he will then again advise the judge of what he thinks the case may be granted, or why, or what we call the grounds can be processed so that we can proceed with the case. And then the judicial vicar reviews of everything and then sets in motion the investigation of the case. So the investigation consists of testimony, hopefully from both parties of the marriage, and also testimony of the witnesses that were named. When all of that information is gathered together, then the judge will make calling the case to be closed for investigation, and now it'll go into the process of judgment. What happens then is that another defender of the bond reviews the whole case and makes any arguments of why the case presumption of validity is to be retained. And then the judge takes the observations of the defender of the bond, the testimonies of the parties and the witnesses, and then makes a decision as to whether the declaration of nullity can be granted or whether it is denied. Once they've made this judgment, he writes an argument as to why the grant or not granted. Then the parties are notified. And if either party wishes, does not like the decision of the court, they have a right to appeal it to the second court instance. For us, that happens to be the Archdiocese of Seattle. If there is no appeal, then the decree of the declaration of nullity is written, the parties are notified that from that moment on, they are free to pursue whatever they wish in their life, whether it might be another marriage or stay single or maybe go into religious life. They're free to do that. And they're free, if they wish, to be married in the church. So that's kind of the process of how the marriage case is handled. And again, what we're looking at is these canons on marriage. The way in which this life lived by this husband and wife, were they living up to this kind of commitment that the church is asking of people? And also, did they understand what they were committing themselves to? Did they have the capacity to fulfill the obligations and the responsibility of marriage? Was there any kind of pressure or any kind of form of force upon them? Was there any kind of one of the parties retaining certain things like, I'm not going to be faithful, or no, I'm just going to, this marriage will last as long as I'm happy, what we call simulation? Did they give full consent to what marriage is about? Or did they refrain or retain the right to, for instance, have unfaithful relationships? Or they didn't want to have permanence, or they were perfectly happy to be married, but children were not to be a part of the scene. So they object to the essence of and the of what marriage is about. So we have what we call grounds to look at to see if this is a valid marriage. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, the initial defender of the bond helps to establish what grounds that might be. So that's kind of the process that we have for the declaration of nullity. Oftentimes people ask us, how long does it take? We tell people that you can expect 18 months for a case to be handled. And we only do that because that's what the code says, is that a marriage case should be concluded within a year and a half, so it doesn't drag on and things like that. Sometimes cases go much faster than that. Sometimes they go a little bit longer because of circumstances beyond our control. But we try to move the cases ahead as fast as we can. Again, the code says that the marriages must be handled in the order in which we receive them. So somebody who presented a case, let's say a year ago, can't have their case delayed because we just got a new one today, kind of thing. So we have to do the cases in order in which we receive them. Again, if there is a case that is ready for a decision and another case that has priority is not ready yet to be judged, then we can go ahead with the case that is ready to have a decision made. Those are that's the formal process for the declaration of nullity. We also have what is called the documentary processes, which are much shorter. They would be things like a Catholic is obligated to be married before a minister of the Catholic Church and 2 witnesses, unless they've had a dispensation. So sometimes we get people who have just been married civilly, or maybe before a minister of another church. There might be the case where somebody has been married before and now wants to get married, or was married, but had no declaration of nullity from that previous marriage. Also, there's what sometimes happens is the proper form for marriage is not being observed. For instance, that we have to, for a marriage to be valid, it also has to have 2 witnesses and a minister of the church for Catholics. So we have times when we have a marriage take place that it's just the bride and the groom and the priest or deacon were there. There was no witnesses. There's sometimes the priest who witnessed the marriage did not have faculties or have the right to witness the marriage in the church. So these are all documentary cases and are simply handled by documents. For instance, the marriage license shows that there were no witnesses, or maybe there was just one witness. So the form was not properly followed. Like I say, the priest maybe not have the faculties of the diocese. He comes in from another diocese and witnesses the marriage, but has no permission or get granted faculties to do so. That's invalid. Like I say, a previous bond that has not been declared null does not allow for a marriage. That's called a legamen case. So these are documentary cases that, again, when we have the proper documents, we can simply say that the marriage was invalid from the very beginning. So those, like I say, are kind of the bread and butter of the Office of Canonical Concerns. But there are other issues that we face too. For instance, priests who have left the ministry seeking a laicization from the Holy Father, we do the process for them. And there's certain rules that we have to follow for that. So we can seek that they can be laicized, that is, reduced to the lay state, and no longer obliged to follow celibacy, so that they may be married if that is their choice. We also, the bishop will have us write documents for him or letters for him, granting permissions. For instance, a priest who wants to confirm are already baptized Catholic, so they write and ask the bishop if they can be the minister of confirmation rather than the bishop himself. There's just whatever situations come up that the bishop needs help with or needs advice about. That's what our office is trying to do, is to give him a pathway in which to act. More recently, unfortunately, we've had to do penal law cases where, again, somebody in the church has, shall I say, misbehaved, and now they're being have to be prosecuted for the wrong that they have done. And the most common right now would be the sexual abuse cases that we hear about in the church. So our office would be in charge of doing the process of the trials for an individual who has been accused of these things. Then there's just the day-to-day kind of things that a priest call about. They need some information about how to handle a situation, or they have a question about the celebration of the sacrament in a particular instance. Sometimes we get people themselves who call and say, this is my situation. What do I have to do? And again, we try to provide for them the pathway to resolve whatever issue they're facing. So that's the kind of the rundown of the office. We're almost, you might say, secretive, because it's everything that we do is confidential. So we go about our business and try to, again, like I say, help people to be able to live a more full life, trying to address their issues and their concerns, and to give them a way in which, again, to understand that the church wants them to be as fully alive in their spiritual life as possible. So that's my presentation. I hope that's helped a little bit. I don't know if you have any questions or not. If you do, you can just put the chat there and I'll try to answer whatever questions you may have. I'll just mention the staff is myself am the judicial vicar, and then Father David Jimenez is the adjutant judicial vicar, so that the bishop has given me certain rights to make privileges and dispensations and things like this. For instance, if somebody wants to be married outside of the church, let's say in a backyard or something, which we don't encourage, but for reasons that they have, it may be conflict in faith life. I remember when I was in Kennewick, I had a family who the groom was very strong Catholics, and the bride was an Assembly of God person. And the Catholic parents would not come to the wedding if a priest or deacon was not present. And the Assembly of God parents would not enter a Catholic church. And they would refuse to go to the marriage if it took place in the Catholic church. So through permission with the bishop, we had an outdoor wedding where I was present for the celebration. And so happy compromise was made for the wedding. So that kind of, that's called a dispensation from form. I, as judicial vicar, the bishop's given me permission to give those kinds of dispensations. I have other privileges also that he gives me, rather than, in a sense, he being bothered about them. So I act in the name of the bishop, who is the judge for the diocese. When I judge a case, or Father David occasionally will be a judge in a case, as will Father Jesus Mariscal. Again, they do so by permission from the bishop. I hope that's helped a little bit, and thank you for listening to me. Okay, let's see here. Is it my understanding in presenting a marriage case that the marriage, oops, I lost it. Larry, how do I get to the chats?
So on the bottom, you should have a section where it says chat. So if you like move your mouse around towards the bottom, and then it should show chat. But if not, I can read the questions.
Yeah, would you mind doing that right now? My computer is doing all kinds of funny things.
Yes, no, that's fine, Father. So the first question is there any time that a defender of the bond does not have evidence to support or defend the bond?
Yes, I mean, if the defender says that they see no facts here that would support the declaration of nullity, that is his job to make that present to the judge. And again, the judge takes into consideration the observation of the defender of the bond, and if he also finds that it is true, there's no grounds for it, or there's not enough evidence to prove that the declaration of nullity is not, the proof is not there, then it either can be, the case can simply be denied any further process, or it would, if it's gone through the process, and the judge then will declare the marriage to be valid and no declaration of nullity will be granted. One of the things that that we tell the petitioner is that they are responsible for proving the invalidity of the marriage. And if there is not enough proof for that, then that the declaration is not granted, and the marriage is considered to be valid, and they're not free to marry in the church again. Okay, so number 2.
The other question was, what is the role of an advocate and how does one become an advocate?
Okay, the role of the advocate is to walk with the petitioner or the respondent in presenting their case. So they help the person to go over their testimony, they may want to ask questions about, could you clarify this point, or could you say more about this particular question? Because it doesn't help us at all if people just simply answer yes or no. We want to know why they say no to a question or why they say yes. To give examples, for instance, let's say that the person says that they were abused during the relationship. Well, could you give an example? Well, he came home drunk and he beat me up, or there was constant, putting me down, or not, appreciating anything that I did. So that's the test. Like I say, that's what the advocate does, is help to present the best possible case for the individual who has petitioned the court. How a person becomes an advocate is that we have workshops periodically. We try to have them at least once a year, and we then ask people to come forward to go through the whole process in more detail, so that they might be trained to be advocates for them. And we're always looking for people who would be willing to do that. Again, they help get the paperwork necessary for a case. They would, again, go over the testimony of the petitioner or the respondent. They would try to encourage the witnesses to respond to the questionnaire that they get. They act on behalf of the individual, and they can contact the court to ask about how the case is moving along, or if they want to present more evidence or more documents for the case, they can do that. So they basically are acting on behalf of and in the name of the petitioner or the respondent. And like I say, we're hoping to have a advocates workshop in March of this coming year. We haven't quite pinpoint the date yet, but we want to do it before Easter of next year. So if you can if you're interested in being an advocate, let our office know, and then we can contact you and let you know when our workshop will be. And then also we are there to help the advocates also in doing their work to help the individual who's seeking the declaration of nullity. Okay. Is there another question?
Yeah, there was one more question. It says, it is my understanding in presenting a marriage case that the marriage case does not get into line until the libellus, is that how you pronounce it?
Right. Mm-hmm.
From itself has been submitted. If the libellus is submitted, but the case is waiting on other documentation, does the case get into line?
Yeah. Well, once we get the libellus, in order to have the libellus, what it's basically, a libellus is a petition to have a case investigated. It's just a nice fancy Latin word. So usually what happens is that we ask that the party who is petitioning gives us a copy of the marriage certificate, a copy of the final divorce decree, a short history of the marriage, the relationship, then also that they would like to have an advocate appointed to their case, and the advocate reviews the documents and the testimony, and then that is all presented to the court, And at that point, the court then looks at whether the case should be accepted or rejected. If it's accepted, then things move forward. A more formal questionnaire is sent out to the petitioner and the respondent, and the case proceeds from there. So all the documentation has to be done before we can begin, before the petition can be presented to us. Okay. All right.
We have another question, Father.
Okay.
It says, would the workshop be only for the new advocates, or should all those who are currently advocates also attend that workshop?
When we have the advocates workshop, we encourage our present advocates to come again, because it's a good time for review. Also, because of their experiences with working with cases, they may have particular questions that they would like to ask and be answered. So we have it for, if there's a large number of advocates who have been doing this for some time, we may have a separate section for them. But new people who are interested in becoming advocates, we have a workshop specifically geared for their instructions and to help them prepare to be an advocate.
Those are all the questions we have, Father.
Okay.
But if you would like to end prayer, or if anybody wanted to say anything.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a good Christmas, and God bless all of you, and take care of yourselves. Okay.
Merry Christmas.
As they say, sayonara.
Thank you, Father Ibeck.
Thank you, Father.